The war was everywhere. It was in the skies, in the ruins of cities, in the smoke that clung to broken buildings like ghosts. The ground shook not just from weapons, but from the weight of grief itself. Humanity had been fighting for years so desperately, stubbornly, refusing to die quietly. And in the middle of that chaos was La, not a soldier, not a politician, just one woman doing what she could, picking through what the war hadn't yet destroyed, trying to hold something together, her city, her people, herself. It was on a recovery mission in the outskirts of the scorched zone near Sector Delta that she found him, a body, not fully human, lying amid the wreckage of the shattered skirmisher pod. His armor, cracked and scorched, bore the jagged insignia of the enemy of the alien race Earth had come to know only as the Zerathari. Creatures of war, bred for conquest, cold and unyielding. At least, that was what they were taught to believe. But this one was breathing. She should have called it in immediately. That was protocol. Any alien survivor was to be tagged, secured, and interrogated if they lived long enough. But Asla crouched beside the unmoving figure, eyes scanning the ridged silver flesh, the half-broken breathing mask, the blood-darkened armor. She hesitated. His hand twitched. Not as an attack. Not a threat, just a flinch, a wounded reflex, a spark of life. She felt it in that invisible shift. The line between enemy and living being blurred just enough to make her pause. It wasn't logic. It wasn't pity. It was something else entirely. Something deeper, raw, human. Instead of a call for backup, she reached for her med kit. That one act, small, silent, seen by no one, changed everything. She stabilized him, carefully removing debris, sealing wounds with field foam, bypassing his damaged breathing system with an improvised adapter. He didn't speak. His species communicated differently, not in the shared languages of Earth. But when his eyes opened, a slit pupilled, glowing faintly, wild with instinct and confusion, he didn't lash out. He looked at her, really looked, not as prey, not as a threat, just a broken bar curious. They said the Zerathari had no emotion, that they were genetically engineered for discipline, their minds trained for perfect loyalty to the throne world. But she saw something in his face that no scanner could read, awareness, not just of the pain or the battlefield, but of her. As if, in that moment, he realized she had chosen to save him up and didn't understand why. She didn't know how to explain it herself. They kept him in the underground facility after that. She didn't tell anyone what she had done until it was too late to reverse. Her commanders wanted to interrogate him, use him, trade him, if necessary. But the alien identified eventually as Commander Karex of the Zerathari Vanguard refused to speak to anyone, except her. She was assigned to communicate, to break the silence, to become the voice he listened to. It wasn't trust at first. It wasn't even respect. It was something far more volatile. Curiosity, tension, a strange connection neither of them could define, but both could feel like a crack in the wall of everything they'd ever believed. He watched her with unsettling intensity, eyes never missing a movement. He observed not just her language but her choices, how she treated wounded civilians, how she argued with her superiors, how she sat in the hallway some nights with her head in her hands, exhausted from a world tearing itself apart. She had become, for him, the first contradiction in a war built entirely on absolutes, and she despite herself couldn't stop thinking about him, not as a prisoner, not as a weapon, but as a question, a living challenge to the fear she'd been fed since the first alien ship darkened Earth's skies. It was no longer a story of human versus alien. It was the beginning of something else, something dangerous, something forbidden, but something real. The silence between them was no longer empty. It had shape now. Wait, the kind of silence that wasn't made of absence, but of potential. It lingered between La and Karex, and every shared glance, every moment their eyes met across the sterile confines of the underground holding cell. He had healed quickly, faster than a human could, and though his body was still recovering, his mind was sharp, alert, always calculating. But there was something different in his gaze now, not the coldness of an enemy commander, not even the curiosity she'd first seen. No, this was something softer, something hesitant, as if he was beginning to understand the strangeness of her presence in his world. He no longer saw her as an anomaly, he saw her as a person. It began with questions not spoken in her language, but in gestures, expressions, the subtle rhythm of bodied language that both of them learned to interpret, one moment at a time. She brought him translated documents, videos, explanations of Earth's history, culture, stories. He absorbed them all with unnerving focus, but he didn't just watch them. He felt them. She saw it in the way his jaw tightened at footage of burning cities, at children crying in ruined streets. She saw it in the way his eyes darkened when he watched footage of his own ships leveling human colonies. She never expected that reaction from him. She never expected the question he eventually asked. He taped the screen, pointed to the fire, the chaos, and looked directly at her. Then he placed a hand over his own chest right where his heart should be and slowly tapped once. Why? Not why the war, not why the destruction, but why did it matter to her? Why would she save him? Why would she show him all of this? She didn't have the words in any language to answer him fully, but her eyes did, because she had seen what war did to people, because she had lost someone too, because she was tired of only ever being told who to hate, because she believed he still had a choice. He didn't respond with words. Instead, he reached across the small distance between them and offered her something no Scifistory would ever offer a human. A quiet nod, the first sign of respect, of trust, of the walls beginning to crack. It changed how she looked at him, not just as the enemy, or even as a man, but as someone trapped in a machine much larger than either of them, someone who had been trained to believe that peace was weakness, that mercy was failure. And yet, here he was, choosing to listen, choosing to see her, and in that slow unraveling of their assumptions, something else began to take root. La didn't mean for it to happen. She fought it, questioned it, doubted herself, but every time she saw Karagza, every time he leaned just slightly closer, asked more, listened deeper as she felt the truth of it pressing in on her like gravity. She was falling for him, not because he was an alien, not because of some fantasy, but because he was willing to become something his world told him he couldn't be, because she saw strength in his vulnerability, power in his questions, a kind of quiet nobility in the way he wrestled with everything he'd ever known. She didn't say it, not yet, but love was no longer some distant idea. It had a name now. It had eyes like starlight and a voice that had never once lied to her. It was sitting across from her, and for the first time in this endless war, she felt hope, not for victory, not for revenge, but for a future neither side had dared to imagine. The days turned into weeks, and what began as cautious communication slowly evolved into something neither of them had a word for. It wasn't just about survival anymore, not just questions and answers exchanged between a human and an alien. Now, it was connection, quiet, dangerous, undeniable. The war outside raged on. Cities fell, empires moved pieces on the galactic board, Earth remained under siege, and every day the threat of extinction grew closer. But deep beneath the ground, in a cold facility carved from stone and steel, a spark of something unimaginable was taking shape. La and Karex were no longer just prisoner and liaison. They had become each other's window into a world they never knew existed, and the cracks in Karex's loyalty to the Scifistory Empire were widening. It was a single sentence from La that finally pushed him over that invisible linear, the one between obedience and awakening. "You don't have to fight their war anymore," she said it softly, not as a command, not even as a plea. It was a truth, raw and terrifying, and it landed like thunder in his mind. No one had ever spoken to him that way. No one had ever dared to suggest that he, Commander Karex, bred and trained since infancy to serve, conquer, and die for the Scifistory, had a choice. But La believed it, not just for herself, for him. The silence between them after she spoke stretched on for what felt like hours. But it was broken, and not by argument or rejection, but by a question Karex had never allowed himself to ask. "What if I don't know who I am? Without war?" His voice was low, alien accent heavy, but the fear in it was all too human. La didn't try to answer him. She just stepped closer, close enough for him to feel her breath, and whispered, "Then maybe that's the beginning, not the end." That moment changed everything. Karex stopped cooperating with his interrogators. He stopped reporting through the secret channel embedded in his armor. He stopped being the Empire's eyes and ears. And for the first time in his life, he started making decisions for himself. He asked La to show him more of Earth, of her people, of the stories the Empire erased. He asked about art, about music, about what it meant to feel. And when she played him a human lullaby, soft and ancient and filled with longing, Karex turned his face away, but not before Ella saw the shimmer in his eyes. He was changing, and he knew it, so did she. But with change came danger, because the closer they became, the more the Empire would see him as a traitor. And the more Ella cared for him, the more she risked everything, her career, her people's trust, even her life. Still, neither of them pulled away, because whatever was growing between them had become bigger than the war, deeper than orders, and stronger than fear. Karex, the alien warrior bred for war, was falling in love with the human girl who had refused to see him as a monster. And La, the girl who had once seen only enemies in the stars, was beginning to believe that love might be powerful enough to stop a war no weapon could. It was no longer just a connection. It was a revolution born in silence, sealed in stolen moments, and forged in the fire of everything they were never meant to feel. They found out it was inevitable. Secrets don't last long in wartime, especially when they threaten the foundation of everything both sides believe in. La and Karex had been too careful, but even the smallest spark of something forbidden can't stay hidden forever in a world soaked with fear, suspicion, and blood. The alliance forming in stolen moments and whispered truths between a human girl and an alien warrior was a fracture that the war machine could not allow to spread. It began with surveillance. He is someone watching Karex more closely. Noticing the shift in his behavior, he had stopped responding to command probes. His posture softened when Le entered the room. He asked questions, too many questions for a soldier of the Empire. And worst of all, he had stopped hating. When Le arrived one morning to find armed guards outside his holding cell, she knew everything had changed. Her supervisor looked at her like she was a weapon that had misfired. "You crossed a line," he told her. But his voice was hollow, afraid, because what she had done wasn't treason, it was disruption. She had humanized the enemy. She had taken the faceless war and given it a soul. That was more dangerous than any bomb. The higher-ups interrogated her, demanded explanations, asked what he had told her, what she had told him, but she didn't lie. She didn't need to. She told them exactly what happened. They talked, they shared, they learned to see each other, and in doing so, Karex no longer wanted to fight. That terrified them more than anything. On the other side of the war, the Empire took it worse. Karex was branded a traitor, his name erased from the command hierarchy, a kill order issued without hesitation. There was no room for empathy in the Empire's chain of obedience. And love? That was unthinkable. An infection, a disease to be cut out. The message was clear. He had one choice: return and be cleansed, or stand by a broken bar and be hunted. And he stayed. When La was suspended from duty, Karex demanded to see her. He didn't ask for escape. He didn't beg for protection. He just said, "They will come, for both of us. I need to know if what we have is worth dying for." She looked him in the eye, trembling but unafraid, and answered, "Number, it's worth living for." That night, everything burned. The Empire sent the surgical strike, a small, lethal squad designed to retrieve or eliminate Karex, but they didn't expect resistance. They didn't expect him to fight his own kind, and they certainly didn't expect a human girl at his side, wielding every scrap of human ingenuity, fighting not just for herself, a broken bar, but for him. Side by side, they fought like nothing the enemy had ever seen. Not for conquest, not for vengeance, but for a future no one else believed in. The facility was lost, but La and Karex escaped. And in the fire of that betrayal, they found clarity. They weren't fugitives, they were the beginning. Their escape wasn't just survival, it was a statement, a declaration that love, when it blooms in the middle of chaos, doesn't tiptoe into history. It kicks the door open and dares the universe to stop it. La and Karex vanished into the wastelands beyond the southern perimeter, past the scorched earth that once held cities and families and hope. Drones scoured the sky. Sensors hunted for heat signatures. Both Earth and Zera, their command, wanted them silenced, the one for disobedience, the other for treason. But they kept moving, not because they had a plan, but because they had no choice. Because if they stopped, even for a moment, the world would swallow them whole. It should have broken them, but it didn't. Out in the open world beyond the sterile walls, the monitored cells, The guarded silence as if something happened to Carx. He changed, not in ways visible to the eye, but deeper. He stopped walking like a soldier, stopped speaking like a commander. He began to see the world at its colors, its wildness, its unfiltered, imperfect beauty. He asked questions not out of duty but curiosity. He laughed, softly at first, like it was a foreign language, and he listened to Liz stories, not because they held military value but because they meant something to her. And that was what moved him most. She wasn't trying to convert him. She wasn't trying to win him. She was just a broken bar being herself, honest, flawed, brave in a way he couldn't calculate, and somehow, that made her the most powerful force he had ever encountered. They found refuge in a ruined observatory far from the war zones. Le restored parts of it using salvage tech. Carx reinforced it, built defenses using alien alloys and human ingenuity. Together, they made something new. Not a fortress, not a bunker, a sanctuary. There, under a broken sky and stars unfamiliar to him, Carx looked at La, and not as a human, not as a threat, not even as an exception, but as home. He told her, one night, in the soft language of his peoply half-whisper, half-melody, that he had spent his life conquering worlds but had never once lived in one, never felt the weight of air that wasn't sterilized, never tasted food made with care instead of programming, never felt the terror and peace of holding someone's hand, until her, and La, with tears she didn't expect, told him that she had always feared the war would be the end of everything, but maybe, just maybe Broken Bar, it had brought her to the beginning of something greater. They stopped running that night, because they knew the fight ahead wasn't just survival, it was about showing the world or both worlds so that connection was stronger than command, that choosing each other was the rebellion no one could see coming, and they were ready to face it, together. The message came at dawn. It wasn't from Earth. It wasn't from Zarath either. It was something else, unauthorized, untraceable, and deeply dangerous. A signal broadcast across unguarded channels, picked up by abandoned satellites, low-frequency relays, and the kind of backdoor networks only rebels or ghosts knew how to use. At first, La and Carx thought it was a trap, a locator ping, a way to flush them out, but it wasn't. It was a voice, human, shaky, fearful, hopeful. I heard what you did. I don't know if this will reach you, a Broken Bar, but if it does, I want you to know people are talking. Some of you say, Broken Bar, we believe you're right. Carx stood frozen, staring at the makeshift comm screen as the message repeated on loop. La felt her heartbeat thunder against her ribs. This wasn't surveillance. This wasn't a warning. This was the beginning of a wave. More followed. Days later, another voice, Zarathari, this time, softer, more controlled. The Empire told us you betrayed your kind. But I watched the footage. I saw what they didn't erase. I saw her, and I saw you hesitate. That moment, a Broken Bar, it stayed with me. Commander Carx, a Broken Bar, if you can still hear the stars, know this, you are not alone. La looked at Carx, and for the first time, he didn't look like a weapon. He looked like a man standing on the edge of something much bigger than even war. People on both sides were watching, listening, waiting. His choice had started a ripple, and the ripple was growing. It had never been just about them, not anymore. Their story of the love between a human girl and an alien warrior was no longer a secret. It had leaked through the cracks in the system, through whispers, through stolen transmissions, through the undeniable power of truth. They had become more than fugitives, more than lovers. They had become symbols. La realized it before Carx did. The stories were spreading faster than weapons ever could. Soldiers were asking questions. Civilians were demanding to see the evidence. Propaganda was cracking under the weight of raw footage, of intercepted logs, of that one undeniable image. Carx shielding La with his own body during the Empire's strike team attack. No empire survives long when its citizens begin to imagine something better, and that's what their story had done. It gave people, humans in Zarathari Alakia, a new possibility, a reason to question, a reason to hope. Carx sat in silence that night, hands folded, staring at the comm unit like it was alive. Finally, he spoke, not to La, but to the air, the stars, the idea of who he used to be. They will come for us. Lou stepped closer. Then we don't run. He turned to her. "They'll try to silence us, then we speak louder." His eyes softened. "You're not afraid?" Her voice was calm. "I'm terrified. But love doesn't need permission, and truth doesn't need armor." He nodded, because he understood now. They were no longer trying to escape the war. They were about to change it. The war was no longer just a clash of weapons and fleets. It had shifted subtly, then swiftly into something far more dangerous. An ideological storm, a fracture of belief spreading through both human and alien ranks like wildfire, and at the center of it, whether they wanted it or not, were La and Karex. They became legends in whispers before they ever spoke to a crowd. On Earth, some called La traitor, others called her a visionary. On Zeradr, Karex was condemned, dishonored, and stripped from their military records. But the silence of their governments only amplified their voices. The more authorities tried to erase them, the louder the truth became. Footage leaked. Testimonies emerged. Recruits from both worlds began to defect not to each other's sides, but away from war entirely. In the heart of a ruined world, two outcasts had started to turn the tide. It began with one small outpost on the Martian colonies. A battalion of young human soldiers laid down their weapons after intercepting the same anonymous broadcasts La and Karex had heard. They painted a symbol, a half-Zerathari crest, half-Earth resistance marker on their outpost walls, and sent a message back through the stars. "We choose peace." The message traveled fast. Next came a Zerathari scout vessel that refused to fire on a fleeing human convoy. The captain, under threat of court-martial, simply said, "I saw the girl in the red jacket. I saw the way he looked at her." That was not a lie. That was not weakness. La didn't ask for followers. Karex never planned to lead a movement. But Lavia, a real Lavia, had a gravity of its own, something powerful enough to bend even war. They moved carefully, speaking only when safe, but everywhere they went, others were already waiting. Secret meetings in asteroid stations, quiet allies inside old calm bunkers, engineers, medics, former warriors, those who had seen enough to believe peace was no longer a dream, but a choice. Karex, once silent and obedient, stood before them and said, "I was made to conquer, but I've chosen to protect, not a species, not a flag, but her, and everything she showed me." That sentence echoed across encrypted waves, not because it was political, but because it was true. People didn't follow Karex because of his strength. They followed him because he changed. They didn't listen to La because she was loud. They listened because she believed. Together, they weren't preaching revolution. They were living it, moment by moment, word by word, risk by risk. They weren't generals or rulers, but they were the reason soldiers hesitated before pulling triggers. The reason supply lines were accidentally delayed. The reason two gunships from opposing worlds passed each other in orbit without firing a shot. They had become something no warlord, emperor, or war protocol had planned for. They had become a reason to stop fighting, and for the first time in generations a broken bar both sides began to listen. The war's turning point didn't come from a battlefield, not from a superior weapon or a surprise offensive. It came from a single, impossible decision made not by a general or a council, but by Karex. He stood at the edge of Earth's orbit, inside a hijacked Zerathari command vessel, watching as his own fleet prepared for a full-scale annihilation protocol. The Empire had lost patience, with dissent growing, with units defecting, with soldiers asking why instead of just helping the High War Council decided to make an example. One final assault, no survivors, no second chances. Earth would burn, and La Broken Bar would be the first to go. They hadn't sent a warning. They didn't need to. Karex understood the silence. That silence was the Empire's final word. He had once dreamed of commanding this fleet, of proving himself on the battlefield, rising through ranks to stand at the Emperor's right hand. That dream felt like another life, now a cold, hollow, meaningless, because all of that training, that purpose, that blind loyalty had brought him to this moment, where the people he once called allies were about to kill the only person who had ever seen him as more than a weapon. The ship systems were ready. The encryption codes still recognized his command signature. One word and he could redirect the targeting arrays, delay the assault, disable their communications. But there was no guarantee he would survive it. In fact, there was almost no chance. He didn't hesitate. His voice echoed in his mind, not in desperation, but in defiance. You don't have to fight their war anymore. So he didn't. With one hand trembling and the other steady as steel, Karax overrode the assault protocol, sent false data streams, jammed the fleet's guidance systems, and finally, activated a core feedback loop that would neutralize the primary command vessel's weapon systems for just long enough to trigger internal shutdowns across the formation. The Zerathari fleet never saw it coming. Ships fell from their formations like leaves from a dying tree. Targeting grids blinked out. Auto-fire sequences failed. Confusion spread across the command channels. And then panic. And then silence. It didn't destroy the Empire, but it stopped the massacre. And in that silence, Earth had time to breathe, to regroup, to speak. The war didn't end that die, but it changed. The momentum shifted. The myth of the invincible Zerathari collapsed under the weight of one soldier's betrayal, and not out of hatred, but out of love. Blum met him at the edge of Earth's atmosphere, tears in her eyes as debris scattered in the sky like falling stars. "You came back," she whispered. Karax, bruised and barely standing, simply answered, "I never left." And in that moment, the people of Earth knew they had not only been spared but saved, not by firepower, not by fear, but by a heart brave enough to choose love over orders. The world watched, unsure of what came next. The guns were quiet. The fleets that once darkened the sky drifted without orders, and for the first time in living memory, the silence of space wasn't a warning, it was a chance, a breath between storms. The war hadn't officially ended, but it had lost its rhythm, its urgency, its inevitability. Because of them, La and Karax, two beings who were never meant to meet, never meant to connect, never meant to survive, had changed the story, not just for Earth, not just for Zerath, but for every soul caught between orders and morality, fear and compassion, violence and the hope of something more. Governments scrambled, propagandists fumbled, high councils on both sides issued official denials, called it sabotage, declared it treason, but the damage or the healing was already done. Karax's name, once a symbol of strength and conquest, became something else entirely. On Earth, graffiti appeared in ruined cities. Karax chose peace. Resistance channels shared his speech from the disabled Zerathari flagship. Children wore necklaces in the shape of the makeshift crest he and La created, a blending of two cultures, wrapped in a symbol no one could quite define. On Zerath, it was more dangerous. His name was banned, yes, but it was also whispered, revered in the shadows. His words passed around like forbidden fire, warming the minds of those who had started to question. For the first time, elite warriors refused orders. Scientists leaked data that proved Earth was never the aggressor. And in places where silence once reigned, people began to talk. La became more than a girl with courage. She became a voice, not loud, not angry, but clear, human, honest. "I didn't fall in love with a species," she told the world in a now iconic broadcast, her voice shaking but strong. "I fell in love with a soul." And that was what made it impossible to suppress. Because La and Karax weren't trying to lead anyone. They weren't trying to win over entire planets. They were simply living proof that connection was possible in the most impossible of places. That message, the authenticity of Ida, spoke louder than every speech, every weapon, every lie told by generals and rulers. And so it spread, quietly, relentlessly, across borders, across systems, across stars. Karax didn't return to Zerath. He knew he couldn't, not yet, maybe not ever. But from a hidden station orbiting Saturn's rings, he and La built something new. A place not of exile, but of beginning. A neutral ground for those who believed the future didn't have to be shaped by war. Humans and Zerathari came, not many at first, but enough. They didn't always agree. They didn't always understand each other. But they sat together, ate together, cried together, and slowly, they began to heal. Peace didn't arrive with a treaty. It arrived with trust earned in pieces, traded through conversation, protected by two souls who had nothing to offer but their truth. The war would still smolder for years, but thanks to La and Karax, peace was no longer a fantasy. It was a path, and others were beginning to follow it. In the end, it wasn't a throne or a flag that marked their legacy, it was a garden. Just a simple, quiet place on Earth, grown where bombs once fell. La planted the first seed with her own hands, and Karax, unfamiliar with the ritual but reverent, stood beside her. The soil was dark, scarred, but ready. It had known war, but now it would know something else, life. They had returned to Earth, not as fugitives, not as warriors, but as witnesses to everything war had destroyed, and to what love had dared to create in its place. By then, stories of them had traveled further than either of them had imagined. Not because of technology, but because of truth. The truth that a human girl and an alien warrior had fallen in love in the middle of a galaxy-wide war, and instead of hiding it, they used it to defy hate, dismantle fear, and offer something rare, proof that enemies could become more. It started with a ceasefire, just one border, one region, one exhausted front where both sides agreed to stop, not forever but for now. A fragile silence, but it held. Then came the messages. Low-ranking soldiers who didn't want to fight, scientists who wanted to collaborate, families on both sides who had lost too much and wanted to believe in something better, and finally, leaders wary, watching, but curious. They weren't ready for peace, but they were willing to listen. That's all Up and Corex had ever wanted. They didn't ask for statues, didn't want power. They never claimed to have solved anything, but they had started something, a shift, a movement, a new way to imagine the future, one built not on domination or revenge, but on understanding. The garden grew slowly, like trust, like love, and just like peace it took root in silence, in broken ground, and bloomed toward the stars.